Everyone. I'd like to thank you for attending today's webinar, New Oasha Confined Space Standard and what it is and how to comply. Your Cogno moderators today are Pia Bernardo, Cogno's training consultant, and myself, Kat Amato, the marketing director at Cogno. If you have any questions or have any training needs that we can help you with, please note our emails and phone numbers and feel free to contact either Pia or myself, and we'll be more than happy to help you. As a thank you for attending today's webinar, we are offering everyone an exclusive 30% discount off of all of the 51 courses we have available in our marketplace from today's host safety author, UL. Simply use the coupon code Confined Spaces as shown on the slide here at checkout. Now, before we begin today's webinar, I wanted to take a moment just to thank our partner community who have invited their members and clients to attend today's event. Cogno partners with many different business segments to provide online training courses directly from their website, so their members and clients have a convenient place to purchase the training they need. If you're not a Cogno partner, email me today at info@cogno.com and I'll send you information on how to sign up. It's easy and completely free of charge and a great way to earn some extra revenue for your company. Now, in addition to safety and OSHA-related courses, we also have thousands of courses in virtually every business topic available in our marketplace, including human resources, software, business management, and soft skills training, to name a few of the topics available. So be sure to check out our website to search the various options. Now today we're proud to have with us Matthew Kraus. Matthew's professional 18-year career has been spent in a variety of construction, military, and general industry arenas. Matt has had the opportunity to hone his skills with some of the most respected companies in the world, such as HP, General Dynamics, UL, Toyota, and Washington Group. He has gained extensive field experience managing highly hazardous chemicals and processes, such as ISO 14001 and OSHA 18001 auditing compliance. Matt is a certified safety professional, certified hazardous materials manager, and a certified environmental safety and health trainer. Matt is also a Department of Defense Range Safety Officer and Radiation Safety Officer, being an authorized OSHA outreach trainer for construction and general industry. He holds a bachelor's degree in occupational safety and health and a master's degree in environmental science from Jacksonville State University in Jacksonville, Alabama. Matt has published construction safety articles in numerous periodicals, including Business Owners Monthly and Workplace Safety Magazine. He is a professional member of the American Society of Safety Engineers. He proudly served in the U.S. Air Force in support of Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm as a loadmaster on a C-142 cargo plane, and I do want to thank him for doing that on our behalf. So it is with great pleasure that we welcome Matthew today.
Thank you, Kat. I always appreciate an opportunity to talk about safety and particularly anything new. OSHA actually had a very busy year last year and released this new standard in construction confined space, which has actually been promulgated for about 18 years. So for about 18 years, it's been an imminent release. And OSHA also released their record-keeping reporting update on January 1 of 2015. So as far as OSHA is concerned, it was a very active year for them. I got a little background noise there. I'm not sure if everyone is muted. But it was a very active year. So the new construction confined space standard is new, and it's more prescriptive than the general industry standard, which has been out for several years. But some of the similarities, and then I'm going to cover some of the differences as well. So a confined space has to meet three criteria. It has to have a limited means of entry or exit, and we'll cover that. Is large enough for a worker to enter, which is a change, because it used to say enter, bodily enter and perform work. and is not intended for regular or continuous occupancies. And some of the examples given in the standard are sewers, pits, crawl spaces, attics, and boilers. Now, in addition to that, you have a permit space. So you have all three of those above categories, and then you have any other additional hazards, such as engulfment, electrical, most commonly is atmospheric. So those are what can make a space go from a confined space to a permit required confined space, in which the full regulation will kick in. So if you're doing both construction and general industry work, then OSHA requirements are met if you're using the construction standard, but not vice versa, because the construction standard is much more prescriptive, and it's got higher criteria. So if you meet that, then you're going to be meeting both activities. And what determines which standard to follow is the activity that you're actually doing. So if you're doing cleaning and maintenance in a construction environment, not actually building or working on the confined space, then you could follow the general industry standard, but it would be preferable to follow the construction standard, and that way you would always be in compliance. So a couple of changes took place. It does not cover, well, it removed the enclosed spaces definition, which used to be in 29 CFR 1926.21 paragraph B. So if you open up the electronic version of that after August 1st of last year, that paragraph is no longer there. But if you have a printed copy, obviously it's still going to be in that standard. It does not apply to trenching and excavation, although you could have a confined space within a trench or an excavation. And the reason those are excluded is because there are specific standards related to trenching and excavation. Again, underground constructions, caissons, compressed air. Now, in power transmission and distribution, there are still enclosed spaces unless there's a hazardous atmosphere, and we'll talk about hazardous atmosphere. And then subpart A, which is the new OSHA construction standard, would apply. And if you have any questions as I'm going through this, feel free to use the chat feature, and we'll review those at the end, and I think Kat is moderating that, so feel free to submit any questions. So when we say limited means of entry or exit, what do we mean by that? Quite simply, can you just walk in or out without the use of your hands or bending, stooping, reaching, or crawling? So can you walk in or out with the ladders without using your hands? Probably not. So that's going to be a limited means of access or egress. Stairs, you could do that without your hands, so that's not limiting. Ramps, it's going to depend on how steep that ramp is. Anything more than a 1 foot for every 12 feet of length or a 112 pitch is generally going to be considered too steep to be, or is going to be steep enough to require a limited means of exit. And what's new for the construction standards is they talk about slip, trip, and head hazards, and even illumination. So if you have any of those things in place that could impede your immediate egress out of the space, then it would qualify as that limited means of egress. Now, is it large enough for a worker to enter? General industry states that you enter and perform work, but construction standard dropped the perform work. In effect, this means if you can get into them, pipes, sewer lines, vaults, then it meets that criteria. 55-gallon drum, generally not, unless you have a very, very small person. Trash hopper, yes. Excavation, probably not, because you have an excavation standard, although you could have a vault or something inside of an excavation where that standard would apply within the excavation. So you're going to actually follow two regulations. 2-foot trench, generally no. OSHA says if you can step up out of something, you're not going to be falling into that criteria. But a 4-foot trench, which will require you to maybe use your hands or pull up on something, then that's a limited means of egress, large enough for you to enter, but you're not completely entered. So again, it comes down to the assessment and meeting all three criteria. Now, when I talk about continuous occupancy, a space that is designed for continuous occupancy, and we'll look at some examples here in a few minutes, when you talk about having the proper lighting and ventilation, is it big enough for you to just stand up and walk around and to move freely about? And you have to consider everyone in the workforce. So if you have a space that has a 6-foot ceiling, it may not feel like a confined space for most people, but if you have some really tall folks, then it's not really designed for continuous human occupancy. And with all three of these criteria, if there is a doubt or a question, then the answer is probably yes, this is a limiting factor. Now, when you have a permit space, so you've met those three criteria, and then you have any other additional hazard, and I've highlighted that, any other additional hazard. And it doesn't have to be what's listed in the standard. They give you some examples such as ventilation, electrical, or mechanical. Those are typically the most common ones. But it could be anything. It could be insect infestation or wild animals or anything that you recognize as something that could be a hazard. Now, construction goes on to specifically address engulfment from liquids and solids such as like gravel or in a sewer line, asphyxiation from gas that may be adjacent to the space that you're working in. So anything that you recognize that could pose a problem takes it up to that next level from a confined space to a permit required confined space. So, we often say in the court of law you're innocent until proven guilty, and that's the way it's supposed to work. But in a confined space, it's a permit space unless you can control it otherwise. And a lot of times that's done by doing a gas testing of the space to make sure there's no ventilation hazards, and everything else has been identified, locked, blocked. There's no other way to get someone injured, then you can take it from a permit required confined space just to a confined space, and you don't have to follow the permit program. Some key terms with the the construction safety standard release are host employer, and that's generally going to be the owner. And this is the terms are pretty important for construction because it establishes who's responsible for what. The controlling contractor is generally going to be your general contractor. Your GC is the employer who has the overall responsibility for construction at the site. That may or may not be the owner or host employer. There can only be one host employer, but you can have more than one controlling contractor, although it's better to have a single controlling contractor and one host employer. And those can be the same, but you cannot have more than one owner. Obviously, an entry employer is anybody who decides that their employees have to enter a permit space. Entry rescue is when you obviously rescue from a space. Now, a competent person is a person capable of identifying hazards and the authority to correct them immediately. Now, the authority is granted by the controlling contractor and the entry employer. The competency is determined based by the employer if they are competent for that task. And there's additional training available to raise that competency level. Engulfment, a new term. It's not a new term, but it's more frequently used in the construction standard. Hazardous suffocation by liquid or flowing solid material, and there's some examples given there. And then there's also a requirement in the construction standard to have an early warning system, and that is an alert for an engulfment hazard may be developing. And it can be a remote sensor, it could be a person standing by. If it's a person standing by, they really need to have no other duties. They may possibly be an attendant to that confined space, but if you have someone who's acting as the early warning system for an engulfment hazard, they really should not have any other tasks. It's important to know that even if you don't have employees that are going to go into confined space, they need to be trained to recognize so they don't enter inadvertently. Now, the controlling contractor entry employers are responsible for identifying confined spaces as soon as they become available or created. A construction environment is constantly changing, and that competent person needs to be able to identify those spaces and label them and communicate to others. But we know construction sites are very rapidly changing environments, so they may come across a confined space that meets those criteria that we covered. So they need to be able to recognize one, even if it's not been marked or communicated at the time. Okay, anyone working in a confined space? These are some frequently asked questions that you can get from the Oasha website and their explanations as well. Obviously, no, you have to be trained to work in a permit space. And you also have to follow the permit program, which we'll cover some more here shortly. And again, I mentioned before, how do I know which one to follow? It depends on the type of work you're doing. But if you're doing any type of construction, even in a general industry environment, if you're making a major modification and repair to a confined space vessel or tank, then you're going to need to follow the construction confined space rule under the new standard. And then there's 5 key differences, and this is probably the 5 key takeaways that you want to understand between construction and general industry. The construction rule has more detailed provisions when there are multiple employers on the work site. So And that goes back to those terms of the host employer, the controlling contractor, the entry employer, the subcontractors. And the idea is to make sure that these hazards are communicated so that you're not causing a problem. So you may be, welding, and you have not any employees going in any confined space, but you set up your welder next to the ventilator going into a confined space. And if you don't realize or recognize what that is, you may be creating an unsafe environment for another subcontractor on the site. And that's the intention of having that rule. Number two, it requires a competent person, which I mentioned before, to evaluate the work site and identify the spaces, and then determine if they need spaces. Now, here's an example document that you can use to do that survey. And again, ask those three questions. Is it large enough? Is it have a restricted means? And is it not designed for continuous occupancy? If you say yes to all three of those, then you go on to answer the questions about having additional space. This is a good checklist to use on a daily basis while you're a competent person to ensure that that's being done. And I'll provide this. Kat can send that out for folks if they'd like to have a copy of that afterwards. Number three, it requires continuous atmospheric monitoring whenever possible. The exception is if it's not economically feasible, and I can tell you that's going to be a losing argument. These meters are getting less and less expensive all the time. The technology is rapidly changing and making them much more user-friendly. So to say that it's not economically feasible to test the atmosphere is a pretty hard argument. And you generally don't want to be in an arguing situation when it comes to compliance. So there are exceptions, but they are very difficult to meet. I've been following the general industry rule for years. What's the difference? Continuous monitoring for engulfment hazards. So if you're doing construction work in a storm sewer, an upstream storm could cause flash flooding. So you could put a water sensor in to let you know, or put an observer upstream. And again, if you're using a spotter, you need to make sure that they're trained, you've documented their training, and they're not performing any other duties. Now again, they might be able to act as an attendant to a confined space if it puts them in the same position to monitor the space and to be the engulfment hazard, lookout. Generally, it's not going to be, that may or may not be possible. It depends on the space and the entry. Now, if you're using equipment such as a sensor, you want to make sure that it is tested and calibrated, and you document that testing and calibration. And lastly, this is a good thing. This is a change that's better than the general industry. General industry, if you had a problem or an upset condition, you had to terminate the entry, pull everybody out of the space, cancel the permit, and start the entire process over again. The construction allows you to have a temporary suspension of that permit, and so you can make those changes and get that space back to the conditions listed on the permit. So, for example, if you were using a ventilator to pump fresh air in, and the ventilator stopped working, you'd suspend the permit, get everybody out of the space, turn the ventilator back on, put the meter back in the space to make sure that it was no other gases had gotten back in there, and you could resume under that same permit. So it's actually an improvement to be able to suspend the permit versus starting over. And the reason OSHA did that is because construction environments, again, are very dynamic. Things are constantly changing, and you don't necessarily have the ability, to start and stop and renew the entire permit process. Also requires employers who direct employees to enter space, make sure the physical hazards are eliminated through, isolation or lockout, tagout, ventilation, typically are the most common ones. And it requires employers, and this is interesting how they put this, relying on local emergency services to arrange for responders that give the employer advance notice if they will be unable to respond. So if they're responding to another emergency. So the bottom line is the fire department, if you're relying on them to be your rescue services, is not going to call you to say, oh, we just got called out to go fight a fire and we may not be able to respond timely to your situation. They're going to respond to their next given situation. So, and the reason they did that is to deter you from relying solely on a local fire department or just calling 911 as a rescue plan. And it also changes, and we're seeing more of this with most OSHA requirements, is that it requires employers to provide the training in a language and vocabulary that the worker understands. So yes, the standards are in English, but if they're not English speaking, it needs to be presented in a manner in which they actually understand the material, not just presented to them, but they actually comprehended that material. So it requires that the employers determine what kinds of spaces their employees will be working in, what hazards could be there, how the hazard should be made safe, and what training the worker should receive. And again, document, document, document. And what to do to how to rescue the workers if anything goes wrong. Typically, this is done by non-entry rescue, where they're attached to a tripod or some type of device that can remove them from the space. But simply saying 911 on your emergency response of your permit is not going to be an acceptable method for rescue. You're required to have a written space program? Yes, and this is not different from general industry. If your employees are going into a space, then yes, they are going to need a written program. And this new rule, again, it affects all industries, because if you are working in a confined space hazard while performing construction work, that activity determines which standard you're going to follow. If you, again, the controlling contractor, what are my responsibilities if you hire a subcontractor? The controlling contractor, rather than host employer, is the primary point of contact, and they're the ones that should be communicating to the other subcontractors. So if you have a subcontractor working and they're going to be doing confined space work or creating confined spaces, they're required to notify that controlling contractor so they can in turn communicate to the other contractors that that work is going on. Going back to that example I gave before, where if you're working and your work may not be an effect in that space, but it could affect that space. So the host employer has to provide information, the owner, to that controlling contractor, and then again we pass that on. This also applies for employers who are not going into spaces. They need to be made aware of that. Outside the space, creating no additional hazards. Yeah, I covered that. So, controlling contractor versus host employer. That could be the same person, but you can't have more than one. The controlling contractor, known and discovered hazards with all entry employers and actually non-entry employers, to let them know that these are the spaces, and it's good to do that on a frequent, perhaps even daily basis, an assessment to identify new confined spaces, and we'll get into some examples of what that looks like. If you are an entry employer, you need to have your written program, and you need to be able to share that with the controlling contractor and any hazards that you are creating or that you encounter that could affect others. And the controlling contractor is responsible to share that information with all employers. Again, it says entry employers, but I have a graphic here. If you have the host employer and controlling contractor, and you have the different subcontractors, and they coordinate throughout the entry. And again, it could be an entry employer or it could be a non-entry employer, so it can change based on what's going on, if they're going into a space or not. And again, only one host employer. Excuse me, I'm going to take just a 30-second break here and catch my breath and get some water.
All right, thank you so much, Matthew. I do want to again thank everyone for attending today's webinar event. And after the webinar, we will be emailing everyone a discount code so that you can take advantage of the exclusive 30% savings on any of the 51 safety courses available from UL. You can see the coupon code directly on the screen right now. It's Confined Spaces, but we'll also email that to you. Additionally, we'll email you a link to today's webinar's recording. We post these on our YouTube channel, so you can review them again for a refresher and also pass that link along to any of your friends or colleagues that were not able to attend today's event. Also, I just wanted to mention briefly that Cogno does have a robust training platform, that's an LMS, available to each of you at no cost. Cogno does not charge for our LMS system. So some of the many features of the training platform include the ability to upload your own internal training documents, process procedures, and then you're able to add groups, you're able to add learners to your groups, then distribute the training to your learners. You can track training progress, run reports, view certificates of completion, and just among many of the features of the LMS. So again, this is available to you at no cost. Simply email me or Pia, and or you can leave a message in the chat feature of the GoToMeeting panel, and I'll send you some information and get you all set up on your free training platform LMS system. And again, if you have any questions at all that you would like to have addressed by Matt during the Q&A session, feel free to enter those via the chat feature. I do already have several that have come in, and I thank you for submitting those. And Matt will be addressing those shortly. So Matt, hopefully you were able to get a couple sips of water now, and I'll turn it back to you.
Yes, thank you. And speaking of that chat feature, let's try something here. Earlier I mentioned there was 3 criteria for confined space, and let's have a quiz real quick. And the first one who can use the chat feature to give the correct answer, I believe Kat's going to be giving away a free course. Now there's 3 criteria to meet for a confined space: limited means of egress, not intended for continuous occupancy, and what is that third criteria? If you could submit that here. We'll take about 10-15 seconds to see who can get that in the fastest, and see if Kat gets a response.
Yeah, so if you think you know that third point, that third criteria, go ahead and put that in the chat feature of your GoToMeeting panel, and we'll see who's the winner. We're going to be giving away you can choose any of the UL courses valued up to $24.95 as a contest winner. So let's see if we have anyone who might recall what that third criteria was. So go ahead and enter that into the chat feature. Again, the question is, there are 3 criteria that must be met for a confined space. So we've got limited means of egress, not intended for continuous occupation, and who could remember what that third criteria is?
I assume I'm disqualified from submitting a suggestion.
I would think so, yes. All right, let me just see what we've got here as far as answers and see if we have a winner here yet. Just looking for the first person who answered correctly. So let me read to you the answers, Matthew, and order that they were received. And the first person that answered correctly, that would be the winner. So I have Erica has said, is large enough. She's the first person that replied, and her answer for the third criteria is large enough.
Large enough for, is that all she submitted?
Is large enough as far as the answer. So I imagine she's, Erica, if you can confirm, I'm suspecting I know what you mean by is large enough on there, but
might hit send before we finish typing. I do that a lot. But yeah, that is correct. It's large enough for the worker to enter. So yes, that is definitely on the right path. Yeah,
and she did clarify that just further down for a worker to enter. So Erica, you were the first to answer it correctly, so you are the winner. Congratulations. So Erica, if you can send me via the chat your email address, after, I will send you a list of the courses that you're able to select one from, and we can get that to you. But I also want to recognize that we have a few other people that did also enter the exact, the correct answer as well. Jill, your answer is correct as well. Thank you so much for submitting that. And also Kathy, thank you for getting that submitted as well. I have Rick that said not designed for occupancy. I'm not sure if there's any
Well, that's one of the two that we're given.
that
So
we're given.
yeah.
Okay, all right,
So
all
yeah,
right.
we're looking for large enough for the worker to enter. So, but yeah, that was great. And I'm going to do another one at the end. So pay attention when you get a chance to win another course.
Okay, great.
Excuse me. So a few more of the questions, and we'll get into some examples. If you're doing both types of work in the space, again, you're going to want to follow construction standard. So if you're in there doing some maintenance and cleaning and prep work, but also doing some structural repair, it's best, instead of trying to go back and forth, just follow the construction standard. Now, interestingly, the American National Standards Institute put out the ANSI Z117.1 standard for confined space entry, and it's in closer alignment to the construction standard than general industry standard, but so we expect that the general industry standard will migrate more towards the construction standard, so it'll be less confusing. But in the interim, it's best just to follow the construction standard because it is more prescriptive. And in the end, it's going to provide more safety for the employee, and we'll cover a few of those key differences. And lastly, state plans. A lot of people work in state plans. 27 states have their own OSHA-approved plan. And they have to follow and update their standard as well. I think Kentucky already was following something very similar to this prior to the release of the standard, and they had to make a few minor changes, but they have to follow that standard as well. So how do you determine if a space is safe? Well, you want to test the atmosphere, and it's typically done with a multiple gas meter. Sometimes they'll call it a 4 or 5 gas meter. But you want to test it to see if the employee is going to need respiratory protection or ventilation, see if it's safe to breathe. The entry might be reclassified to a non-permanent entry situation if a hazardous atmosphere is the only hazard, and by testing with a meter, you determine that it is no longer hazardous. So, example, methane is lighter than air, so you would expect to pick that up higher in that confined space. Carbon monoxide is about the same density as air, so maybe a little further down in the space. Hydrogen sulfide, for example, that rotten egg smell, is heavier than air, so it tend to concentrate in the lower floor levels. And often those gases don't separate and layer like that, high, medium, and low, when there are people in the space or when there's ventilation. So but it can happen like if a space has been evacuated and been left overnight or something. So it's important to check that prior to making an entry. Now, OSHA also requires a specific order for the testing. You know, obviously you have to test for oxygen first. It's because it's the most combustible, because it's the most important for human occupancy. And most gas meters will provide that automatically. Then you next test for combustible gases, and then for toxic gases. And so again, most of the meters do that simultaneously, so you don't have to worry about, did I do the right one? So if you're going into a fairly deep vertical space, maybe test every couple of feet, every 4 feet or so, and then move it around as you're dropping the lead or the hose into that space. So, confined space or permanent space. Obviously, this looks like a big tank or vessel of some sort with a ventilation being pumped into it. Most likely, it's a permanent space. Again, we don't know what's on the other side or step back, but if it's a fully enclosed tank, and that's what's typically called a manway or gangway, if that's where you're going into the space and that's the only way in or out, it doesn't look like it's designed for occupancy, and it may be, once you test it for atmosphere, it's going to determine if it's a permanent space or not. So if there's no hazards in it, like if this was a new construction and the only hazard was the fact that it's a space that meets the 3 criteria, then it would not be a permanent space. But the only way to tell is to test and to document that. So here, a little more obvious one, you have somebody, actually collector, an attendant filling out the permit going into a space of a vessel that looks like it's been in service. And again, so it meets the criteria. Obviously, he cannot walk in or out. It's not designed for him to be in there. he has to crawl in and out of that space, and there may be another hazard associated with it, so it most likely is a permit space. Now here's an interesting one. It looks like a room or a vault of some sort, but just based on this picture that we have here, it looks like the only way in or out would be through that ladder. And again, if you recall from the beginning, if you are climbing a ladder and using your hands, that's a limited means of egress. Additionally, like they're putting some type of paint or coating on this space. I cannot tell. It's like one of them's wearing a dust mask, so that's maybe it's not an actual atmospheric hazard, but obviously some hazards involved in this space. Here's one we get asked a lot about is pipe and duct work. Now, from this example, it looks pretty easy to get in and out. No other real hazards. It's large enough for him to get into. But is it designed for continuous occupancy? Right? So it's meeting 2 of the 3 criteria. It's not meeting all 3. Now, we don't know what's around the corners or in the T-section or whatnot, but again, taking that time to determine if it's going to meet all 3 of those criteria, and then if it has additional hazard, and then it would be that permit space. So obviously, if you're filling out a confined space permit, you're going to want to record that information. And Oasha provides the information. If you go to the Oasha website, there's not a permit in the construction standard. There is one in the general industry standard, Appendix D to the 1910-146, and it gives you the information, but it's not a very user-friendly format. So we've created, well, actually the Government Service Agency has created this confined space entry permit, and I'll make this available as well in a standard Word document and as well as an editable PDF document that you can fill in the different sections within it and then print it out if you need to. And it also includes the line-by-line instructions, so you know exactly what needs to go in the sections. It must be on the permit printed on there. Now, I have an example from one of our actual confined space courses that kind of gives an overview of some information that you'd want to put on that permit. I'll just let this animation run and kind of talk to it. But then again, you can see it's that same document, and it must identify the location of the space and the description of the hazards of the space. And again, it's got a much better professional voiceover narration in our course, but again, it's hitting some of the key points that need to be covered within that space. And every time someone goes in and out, and you may need a second sheet to cover the log time for attendants going in and out of those spaces. You can take the multiple readings of that gas detection throughout. So just a little example of how the course works, again, identifying some of the hazards if you're doing any type of hot work. Here now, I talked about rescue and emergency procedures. Again, you don't want to rely on 911. And then you have the additional comments and remarks. This is where you're actually going to identify for construction that you've got a means to determine if your ventilation system has stopped working. That's another requirement within the construction standard, is to know if your ventilation equipment is required for a space. If it has stopped working, then you need to be able to notify the attendant, and they can notify the entrance to get them out of that space. A lot of times the attendant will be right there, so they'll know, but if it's something where their ventilation is not immediately at the access point, then they need to be able to notify where to get that, to be notified if it stops working. Excuse me. Again, covering some hazardous conditions for a permit space. Generally, flammable gas, vapor, mist in excess of 10% of its lower flammable limit. An oxygen deficient atmosphere, which is below 19.5 or above 23.5%. Typically, it's 20.9%. And when you're doing a confined space test with a meter, if you're seeing any deviation in your oxygen concentration, that should be a clue that something may not be going correctly. Even 1/10 of a percentage point high or low could be an indication that something's not normal in that space. may not be triggering any other activities as far as the sensors looking for methane or hydrogen sulfide or carbon monoxide, which are typically what most gas meters look for. So again, oxygen is the most important one, and be aware of fluctuations in that. Now, get below 19.5%, and it's hard for you and I to function, but bear in mind a fire can function at about 13 or 14% oxygen and going to consume what little oxygen is left in that space. So everything is amplified in a confined space. That's why you don't want to take any chances with fire or any other hazards within that space, because it can drastically change your breathing environment in a matter of seconds. And the hazards aren't limited to what OSHA's list of hazardous chemicals, so just because it doesn't have a permissible exposure limit doesn't mean it's not a hazardous chemical. You also want to consider temperature extremes, and now with the wet or slick surfaces or things inside that could cause you to trip, that could be another recognized hazardous condition that could take a space from just a regular confined space to requiring a permit if it cannot be removed or given a safe egress. That could create a hazard of itself. And again, the construction standard really went further, talking about wet, slick, trip hazards, poor lighting, and even sloped surfaces without defining any of those. And so that kind of gives them the leeway to interpret that to mean if it could be wet, it could be slick, the lighting could be, if it's any question at all, then you're going to want to account for that and treat it as a permit space. We talked, other one after you get past oxygen is carbon monoxide. Most meters are set to alarm at 35 or 50 ppm parts per million from the factory, so that can be changed fairly simply, and most instructions will tell you how to do that. But getting exposed to carbon monoxide, here's some different things that can be experienced. But generally, it's said that if you feel like you suddenly have the onset of the flu that just came out of nowhere, and trouble breathing, and coughing, headache, and dizziness, nausea, is a pretty good indication you got some exposure to carbon monoxide. But it is silent. It has no odor. Other than a meter, it's not detectable. So if your meter is picking up any carbon monoxide, just like any deviation in oxygen, you're going to want to respond to that appropriately and either change the ventilation, evacuate the space, investigate that a little bit further. Talk about oxygen again. Fire can still operate at much lower levels than we can, but obviously a lack of oxygen can cause serious injury, irreversible brain damage, obviously death. We don't function long without it, so very important. Now, some folks have asked me previously, and I included to hear about photoionization detectors, because they know they're dealing with a specific type of volatile organic compound. And so they do make a PID that can check with built-in correction factors. These are typically used to find a leak, to isolate a problem within a space. But again, these are very sensitive instruments, and they need to be used by somebody who's had some significant training in using a PID, because age of the lamp, temperature, humidity, calibration, a lot of things can check that, can affect that. So again, using a multi-gas meter is important, and a PID again can be a useful variant for you as well. You want to replace the gas sensors according to the manufacturer's instructions. Usually it's 1 to 2 years. You want to bump test your gas meter daily, and of course you want to log anything you do related to any type of sensor or meter. Use a certified test gas, and typically that's going to come from either the manufacturer or a recommended lab, and that's going to have very specific known concentrations. And so if your meter does not match exactly, then you know that something may not be right, the sensors may be off, because that is the known concentration. And again, keeping those calibration records is critical. Again, follow the guidelines, use a traceable gas, and then train the operators on the proper methods of calibration. You can send it off to third party for calibration, or you can get the training yourself. But again, you're trying to determine hazards in the space, and then verify that you have acceptable entry conditions. Most direct reader meters have, 3 sensors. Some have as many as 5. And it's also important to remember when using a gas meter, they do not respond instantly. So it takes time so you have a 20 or 30-foot hose going into a space. It will take time for that sample air to go up through the tube, to be drawn into the sensors, and the sensors to respond. So that is why it's key to keep an eye on that sensor, log those readings throughout the entry, evacuate the space if there's any changes. Even if you don't hit the alarm levels, it can tell you that something's going on. And you may see an increase in carbon monoxide if you're doing some, say, hot work in a confined space. And the ventilation may be helping control that, but again, keeping an eye on that and logging that will be very, very key. There's a few links here, and we can make this presentation available to you as well if you'd like, on different sources of information on testing meters and working with confined space equipment. Now, attics and crawl spaces have always been confined spaces, but because they were specifically listed in the construction standard, OSHA put out a fact sheet. We can provide this information for you as well. But yet, if you think about an attic or a crawl space, it's not really designed for you to be there, particularly crawl spaces. Some attics may be. It could have limited means of egress. You got to crawl in and crawl out. And obviously it's large enough for you to enter. So it meets the confined space definition. So the next question is, does it have any other recognized hazards that I need to be aware of to make it a permit space? So again, it's very important to treat those accordingly. And then again, in construction, there may not have been a confined space there yesterday, but there is today. So again, evaluating that space, logging it, documenting it on a daily basis is key. Again, OSHA is the standard for the information available on the new subpart, as well as the ANSI standard. And they have a lot of resources available on their website at your disposal. And like I said, we'll provide as many of these documents that we've referenced in this presentation today. So, I'm going to ask this question. We have time for our last quiz here, Kat. And that is, I mentioned this a few times, what standard should I follow if my workers are performing construction activities and general industry work, such as cleaning or maintenance in confined spaces? Using that chat feature, the first one, I can give the correct answer, and I guess this is a 1 or 2 word answer. We'll win that second free course.
All right, let's see if we can get a new winner for the second question. So again, the question is, what standard should I follow if my workers are performing construction activities and general industry work, such as cleaning or maintenance in confined spaces? So just go ahead and enter your answer into the chat feature, and we'll see who has the first correct answer. Okay, so what I am getting so far, the very first answer is from Rick, and it's construction standard.
Yes.
Is that the winner?
That
Woo,
is.
Rick,
Good job, Rick.
Congratulations. All right, Rick. I think I already have your email address. Yes, you had already sent it for the LMS, so I've got your email address for that. Congratulations, you're the winner on the second contest question. So that provides you a free course from one of the UL courses. I'll send you an email with that list so you can select.
All right, Kat, do we have any questions from anybody that submitted during the presentation?
Right. Yes. Okay. So in conclusion for the webinar, let's do a quick Q&A session. So if anyone has any questions that you want to present to Matt, feel free to enter that via the session. And I do have one that came in earlier, or a couple that did. One is from Jill, and she's asking, and this was during the first half, so she said, what about maritime industry?
Good question. Maritime definitely has their own set of standards. And again, if you're doing construction activities, you're going to follow, and creating a confined space, you're going to follow that construction standard. But otherwise, you're going to fall under maritime regulations and shipbuilding practices. So again, it comes back to the activity defines which standard you're going to follow. Great question.
Okay, excellent. And just coming back to the contest question, I do want to also recognize we had several other people that that had answered after after Rick did, and they also all had the same. So Kathy, you had the same, the correct answer. Richard, you had the correct answer. Congratulations, and Scott as well. So and Nancy as well. So so it looks like a lot of people were attentive to your content. So excellent.
Good.
Let's see here. I have another question that came in. What is a bump test for a gas tester?
Ah, yes, bump test. Well, quite simply, is you're hooking up the gas meter to that known calibration gas, and you just turn it on very briefly, just enough for the meters to respond. You don't have to record the levels, but you just want to make sure that the oxygen, the carbon monoxide, whatever concentration, for your 3 or 4 or 5 gas meter has a response, and then you turn it off and you log the results of that. So if one of them doesn't respond at all, then you know that you may need to do a full-on calibration check for that gas. So you're looking to make sure that it's responding to that, and again, you want to log that daily, and that way you know that your meter is ready to use on a daily basis if you're going to confined spaces every day, or if you're evaluating confined spaces for possible permit spaces. So it's a good practice to do that every day, or if at the very minimum you're required to do that prior to making an entry. So if you haven't done it in a while, it would be good to do a bump test and let the meter check the gases to the levels specified on the known concentration calibration gas.
Okay, great. Jill, I hope that answered your question. If you need any other clarification, feel free to put that into the chat feature. I have another question, Matt. My employees have to crawl under a deck sometimes to work. That sounds awkward. Would this be considered a confined space?
Yeah, generally, yes. Going under a deck is going to be, if you have to crawl under there, it's large enough for you to get under there. You're limited by means of getting out, and it's not really designed for you to be in that space, to move about freely. So it meets the definition of a confined space. The next question is, does it meet the criteria for a permit-required confined space? So, under a deck, you typically wouldn't think of mechanical hazards or chemicals, but you may have some sharp objects or infestations or wild animals or even mold. You might spot some mold by looking at the space. So it's important to check the space. And again, here's an opportunity to use the multi-gas meter just to verify that there's not, type of carbon monoxide buildup or something in that space if air is not be able to move freely about. So having that meter readily available to check the space is always a good idea.
Okay, excellent. Also, we have a question. Is it required to conduct a bump test on the gas meter?
Yes, you do need to do a bump test prior to the entry to make sure that the sensors are responding. You don't have to do a full calibration, except with the manufacturer's recommended intervals, which is usually, 6 months to a year or whenever sensors are replaced. But bump testing is a requirement because you require by the manufacturer to use their equipment, and that's just the practice that you want to follow. I don't think it's actually in the standard that you do a bump test, but you do need to do the bump test in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions to make sure you have a good, reliable meter for a space.
Okay, great. Got another question here. This question is, I don't allow my employees into confined spaces. Do I have to do anything?
At the minimum, you should have training to show that you train employees to what a confined space is, recognize those criteria. So even if it's not marked, which is required, but signs fall off, and like in construction, environments are constantly changing. So at a minimum, you'd want to train employees to recognize confined spaces so they don't find themselves in a partially finished basement where the only way in or out is through a ladder. So that's a great question.
Okay, excellent. At this point, I don't have any more questions on the chat feature. If anyone thinks of anything that you wanted to present to Matthew after the webinar, and feel free to email me or Pia. You have our email addresses, or just simply info@cogno.com, and that will get to us as well. And we can get this over to Matthew, and he'll be able to address your questions directly for you. So Matt, in conclusion, is there anything else that you wanted to do to conclude your session?
No, I appreciate the opportunity. Again, anytime I can speak about safety or confined spaces, I appreciate the opportunity to do so. If you have any questions related to this or any other safety topics, feel free to reach out to me via the contact information, and I'm sure I'll make that available as well.
Excellent. Well, I do want to thank you so much, Matthew. This has been a very informative session. I do also want to thank everyone again for attending today's webinar. Be sure to look out for the email that we'll be sending later today. It might be tomorrow at the very latest, but we're aiming for later today. And that will have a coupon code. It will have the link to today's recording that's posted on our YouTube channel, and also some additional resources that Matthew had referred to during the webinar. You can also feel free to email Pia or myself with any questions that you have about any training needs that you have, or how to provide recommendation and special pricing, and all partnering with Cogno to resell courses on your website. We would love to partner with you to do that. I hope to see you all at a future Cogno monthly webinar event, and I wish you all a great day. Thank you so much.